Hello, everybody. I'm Felix Wemheuer, professor for modern China studies at the University of Cologne, and this is my YouTube channel, Studying Maoist China. Today, I have a distinguished guest. It's Isabella Weber. Hello, Isabella.
Hi, Felix. Thanks so much for having me on the show. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. So these days, Isabella have to give a lot of talks and interviews on her new book. It's called How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. It came out with Routledge this year. And Isabella is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amhert, and she has 2 PhDs, one in economics and one in developmental studies from Cambridge University and from the New School of Social Research. Her book is focused on debates in the 1980s, but it has a lot of links and relation also to Maoist China, because in the 1980s, the economists would debate the problems and challenges of the traditional planned economy and how to reform it. And as we will see, many reform proposals were already developed during the Mao era, but not enforced. So my first question is, the evaluation of the economic record under Mao remains controversial until today. Some scholars claim that in 1978, the Chinese economy was bankrupted and ruined, while others argue in the Mao era, some industrial foundations for the economic success in the 1980s were established. Which problems of the traditional planned economy did Chinese economists identify openly in 1978? How were personal experience of key economists such as Xu Muqiao linked to their critique of the classical system of economic planning?
Thanks so much, Felix. This is a great question. Let me briefly comment on the first part of your question of the contrast between the Maoist economy either being bankrupted or having laid the foundations for later economic success. I think that the logic of escaping shock therapy points to the insight that on the one hand, reform was important in the late 1970s. On the other hand, not destroying the core of the planned economy was an element of the success of reform policies. So in other words, while reform was indeed an urgent material necessity as a result of the shortcomings of the Maoist economy, at the same time, some key economic achievements, such as the building up of infrastructure, the building up of heavy industries, building up of public health facilities and public education, was in fact part of what enabled China to rise as quickly as it did from the reform era onwards. So in that sense, my book is kind of trying to reconcile these two positions that might be thought of as irreconcilable. Sorry. Now to your question, what were the problems of the Maoist economy that gave impetus to reform? In the interviews that I've conducted with a wide range of economists who violently disagreed on the question of how reform should be conducted, there was a pretty broad agreement that in the late 1970s, reform was a choice of no choice. This was the case, so reform economists argued, since the basic problems of feeding and clothing the masses well were not resolved. So in that sense, they located the urge for reform in the very basic material conditions of the masses of Chinese people in the late 1970s. I think this has to be seen in the context of the failure of the attempt at another big push under Huagofeng, which was a pretty drastic failure, and in some sense was the last attempt of trying to pursue a Soviet-style industrialization. The reason this was an attempt the reason that this attempt was a failure had to do with the not discovered oil reserves that were meant to finance the import of foreign technology, but on a more fundamental level, that failure of the 10-year plan challenged the idea of pursuing a planned big push type of industrialization. So this this presented the context in which some of the proposals that had been developed long before the late 70s were being revived. This included proposals such as those by Sun Yat-sen and Xu Muqiao, some of which dated back to the 60s, some of which were drafted while they were chanted during the Cultural Revolution, or in the case of Sun Yat-sen, even in prison. But it also included a revival of a way of thinking about the economy that dated back to an earlier period, which is the period of the Chinese Civil War and the revolutionary struggle of the communists. In particular, Xu Muqiao played an important role in designing the so-called strategy of economic warfare, which was based on the idea of using market mechanisms as part of the toolkit that the communist revolutionaries could rely on in their struggle, whereby the idea was that the stabilization of the communist currency of the time would require that that money would be able to buy the most basic necessities. So if people thought that they could use this money to buy what they needed, simply put, that would ensure that that this money would actually have a value. So therefore it would stabilize the prices expressed in this kind of currency. This gave rise to a very flexible and agile way of thinking about the relationship between markets and political organizations that in some sense is reflected in the thinking of Xu Muqiao, even in the late 1970s and early 80s, when it comes to the revival of market mechanisms in China. So one of the big
So Xu Muqiao carried out this policy in Shandong, right, in the revolutionary base areas already in 1940s.
Correct, yes. He was one of the key thinkers and strategists in developing these policies in the Shandong base areas, correct. So in the late 70s, there was a sense that the planned economy in its old model had failed and that one needed more market mechanisms. But the question was how to introduce these market mechanisms into China's planned economy. And in this context, these previous experiences with using markets as a strategic tool were being revived.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to ask a more broad question. So in the first half of the 1960s, during the so-called Lieberman debate, reform-minded leaders and economists argued in many state socialist countries that planning and price setting should be based on the law of value, Wertgesetz. In China, Sun Yat-sen, you already mentioned him, developed a similar reform proposal already in the 1950s that enterprises should use profit as a major category in order to increase productivity. In the aftermath of the famine in '61, in some Chinese provinces like Anhui, agriculture collectives were even dismantled and family farming introduced. Which aspects of the Chinese reform agenda in '78 were actually new or different to market reforms in Eastern European countries such as Hungary or Yugoslavia? What elements were revival of ideas that had been already been developed in China before the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah, as recent scholarship has pointed out, there's of course a lot of continuity in certain attempts at using market mechanisms in a bottom-up fashion throughout the Mao period, and then the reform, the beginning of reform and opening up. I think that it's important to acknowledge this. At the same time, I think that we cannot think of the reform period as simply releasing the constraints that have been imposed in the Mao era, and then basically finally letting the bottom-up initiative have their way, which then would result in a vision where the Maoist economy was simply an aberration in history compared to what was already there in the 50s or 60s. I think this would be too much of a shortcut in understanding how history played out. At the same time, it's of course important to acknowledge that some of these ideas were already there. As regards Sun Yat-sen, his thinking about the law of value was quite distinct and quite important, and in fact breaking new ground, not only in the context of China, you mentioned the Lieberman debate, but even in relation to Lieberman, since he came up with his ideas in the 1950s, so even predating the respective debates that were initiated by Lieberman. His main take on the law of value was one that came from an accounting perspective, where the idea is that you could account for costs in terms of some sort of labor units, and thereby calculate what the correct price should be, and that then prices should reflect values in the sense of being based on calculations that reflected specific costs that went into the production of certain goods. So from that perspective, there was the idea that there is a scientific method of determining correct, rational prices. Then, of course, he put emphasis on the idea of using the profit motive to incentivize individual enterprises to design their production decisions in ways that would be reacting to both the drive towards profit as well as to these rationally calculated prices. This is, in terms of the broad outlook, quite similar to the ideas of Oskar Lange and other market socialist thinkers that became prevalent in the Polish context. In contrast, Wemheuer had a much more empirical, if you want so, approach to the law of value, where he thought of it not as the equality of labor content or labor values and prices, but rather as the mechanism that resides in a constant deviation between value and prices as a result of the fluctuations in markets, which is basically the mechanism that on average makes prices to tend towards values without prices ever necessarily coinciding with values. So from that perspective, there's a very different emphasis in the understanding of the law of value, and it's not so much on the calculation-based creation of rational prices, but it's more on the mechanisms that drive the dynamic that is brought about by the law of value. So from the perspective of Wemheuer, then, it's the reform is not primarily about calculation-based rationalization of prices, but it is about enlivening markets as one mechanism in the toolbox of economic governance, if you want so.
Yeah. So the next question will be about the 1980s anyway, so we can go more into detail then. So why did many economists consider agriculture and the price system as key issues in the 1980s? In your book, you show that it took years that the market was fully rehabilitated as a key concept for the distribution and allocation of resources, right? It was only in the 1990s when the party said China would be a socialist market economy. You argue that the major conflict in the 1980s was not between so-called conservatives and reformers, but inside the reformer camp. You identified two factions. One promoted a gradual reform based on a dual track system of plan and market, while a more radical faction called for a shock therapy, meaning a sudden lifting of price setting and control. What were the key arguments on both sides, and why do you think is this conflict so important to understand the development of the Chinese economy?
Yeah, so why was it important to think about agriculture and to think about the price system? Let me begin with this question. As you have shown in great empirical detail in your own work, Felix, during the Maoist period, a mechanism of basically what Robert Ashe called squeezing the peasants, of extracting resources from the countryside to finance urban industrialization, was at the core of the industrial model. This involved the so-called price scissors, which systematically underpriced agricultural goods and systematically overpriced urban industrial goods. So therefore, the Maoist industrialization was based on an unequal exchange between the countryside and the urban industrial economy, which was designed into the ways in which prices were structured. Now, there was not only redistribution between countryside and urban industrial economy, but also redistribution within the industrial sector, where prices for consumer goods were relatively high and prices for more upstream industrial inputs and raw materials were relatively low, which meant that there was a profit extraction from downstream industries towards financing upstream industries, while the low prices for key industrial inputs were meant to encourage the production of more downstream goods. So from that angle, the price system in the Maoist period was really a mechanism of redistribution across different sectors, urban, rural, but also within the industrial system. This was not a price system that was designed to incentivize individual production units to react to price signals. So when there was a revival of the idea of transferring more responsibility to enterprises and relying more on the pursuit of economic interests by individuals and cadres, there was a need to redesign the price system, since the existing system was conditioned on the idea that some units would, by design, be running losses. So therefore, the question of how to reform prices was on the agenda already very early on. And this included fairly early on also ideas about reviving market mechanisms. Already in Wemheuer's writings of the late 1970s, you can write about the use of the law of value, which ultimately, in the way in which he's interpreting the law of value, entails the use of price mechanisms as market signals. At the same time, of course, even Deng Xiaoping already in 1979 talks about the using market mechanisms under socialism, and therefore already points to this possibility. Nevertheless, as you point out, on the ideological level, it takes another 12, 13 years until the socialist market economy becomes the official kind of slogan. So we get this falling apart of the development on the ideological level and the discussions within more technical economic circles over questions of reform design that is already talking about the use of markets long before this has been acknowledged as the overarching principle for China's economy. Now, in trying to think about this problem of how to introduce market mechanisms into a planned economy where the price system had been designed along the lines as I've just described, these two camps emerged, as you just pointed out. One camp basically argued, coming from the perspective of the agricultural reforms and the emergence of the dual-track system and the household responsibility system in the agricultural reforms, that this same kind of logic could also be transferred to the urban industrial economy, where basically the core of the planned economy would in the first instance keep running. Every socialist production unit would continue to receive their assigned inputs and would continue to produce their assigned output as set in the plan. But to the extent that they could produce beyond the plan, they would be given permission to produce more than what the plan was asking from them. This, to some degree, emerged endogenously as a result of the agricultural reforms themselves. Then, since as the rural population started to produce for the market, was generating cash incomes, they started to demand both production and consumption goods in return for this cash. Consumption goods in order to upgrade their consumption levels, but also production goods, since there would have been no township and village enterprises if it wasn't for certain inputs that would be coming from the urban industrial system. So one camp of reform economists was basically arguing that this dual track system that was emerging more or less spontaneously out of the dynamic of agricultural reforms should be systematized, should be turned into an official formal contract system, and should be used as a mechanism towards reform, where the existing institutional structures under the planned economy would be used as market creators, and the logic of liberalization and letting go would only be applied to minor peripheral parts of the economy in the first instance. In contrast, a reform thinking emerged in the 1980s that connected to the Eastern European reform debates, and that was in dialogue with Eastern European emigre economists who had been critical voices in previous reform attempts in Eastern Europe, but by the 1980s, had, broadly speaking, left their socialist home countries and were now engaged in these dialogues with Chinese reform economists. This was by no means an exclusive dialogue between Chinese and Eastern European emigres, but these dialogues did play an important role. So from that second perspective, a kind of reform thinking emerged that suggested that instead of using the planned institutions to create markets, one would have to get rid of the planning structures. One would have to liberalize prices to make space for the market to emerge spontaneously. So in one case, the state has a role of actively creating markets. In the second case, the state is meant to withdraw from its planning activities in order to make space for the market to emerge in a horizontal fashion between the enterprises. Now, this second perspective also suggests that the main link between the state and the market should be a macroeconomic kind of regulation, where the state is not directly participating in the market, but guiding the economy through macroeconomic policies. And the second perspective, as such, was incredibly critical of the idea of a continuation of a dual-track system, which was built on the active participation of state institutions in the market. And they argued that this would result in corruption, in rent seeking, and would create frictions that might be even worse than the situation under the planned economy.
Yeah, and why was this so important? So of course, there's this argument then that the price reform led to the big inflation in 88, and the inflation then resulted into unrest and finally into the Tiananmen movement and the massacre. Is this the reason why this debate is so important, or?
This is one of the reasons why it's very important. This is the political reason why it's very important. But in fact, in 1988, as I'm arguing in the book, the dynamic, in some sense, had reached beyond what economists were influencing. So in 1986, China attempted a wholesale price liberalization. And at that point, I'm arguing the voices of economists were actually quite critical in reversing such a wholesale, rapid price liberalization, in particular liberalization of key upstream industrial goods. In 1988, in contrast, the reform had reached a point where it was clear that not everybody stood to benefit from reforms, and that reform and markets would bring about deepening inequalities, while at the same time, within the political leadership, the resistance on the part of those who initially thought that reform was necessary, but then by the late 1980s thought that reform was going too far, was becoming more and more organized and forceful, so that Deng Xiaoping saw himself in some sort of a deadlock where he thought that the reform agenda itself had to be rescued, and in this context tried to pursue the strategy of crushing through the gate of price reform, that is, tried to initiate a radical type of price liberalization. However, this was happening in a context of already rising prices, and the announcement for these price reforms was enough to unleash panic buying and bank runs, which then creates this social turmoil and social atmosphere of social protests that is part of the context of why reforms are being reversed in 1988 and part of the context of what then happens in 1989. But I think that beyond this specific episode, which is of course incredibly important and consequential, that unpacking these two different logics of thinking the state-market relations tells us something about a more continued confrontation of different visions for reform in China that goes beyond the specific incidences of the 1980s, and in some sense has still implications even until today.
Yeah, I think that leads us to the last question. It's exactly about that. So the title of your book is that China escaped the shock therapy. In a discussion of your book in the New Left Review, Joel Andreas argues that shock therapy was only delayed and it would have been enforced under Prime Minister Zhu Rongji in 1998, when parts of the state-owned industries were privatized and tens of millions of workers laid off. However, it seems that you still consider the Chinese model as an alternative to Western neoliberal capitalism. Why?
Yeah, so to be clear in terms of the terminology, I'm thinking of shock therapy as a quintessentially neoliberal type of policy package, but in some sense, the most extreme form of neoliberal reform. So not doing shock therapy does not mean to not embrace certain kinds of neoliberal policies. Now, if we look at the 1980s and the kind of people who were arguing against shock therapy in the 1980s, who were young economists who had risen in the political ranks thanks to Zhao Ziyang's protection and promotion of their ideas, then we can also see that many of them actually lost their positions of influence in 1989. And in the early 90s, those who in the 80s were arguing for more radical kinds of reforms were actually starting to get the upper hand. Even Zhu Rongji, if one looks at some of the early World Bank documents of the 1980s, the name Zhu Rongji shows up. He was someone who actually, at the time, already in the early 80s, was in dialogue and in fact even assisting parts of the World Bank initiatives in China. Now, to speak more precisely to the question of layoffs and privatizations in the late 1990s, these were, of course, shocks. These also followed a neoliberal logic of needing to privatize and needing to lay off workers who were not contributing to some vision of efficient production. Nevertheless, I do not think that this followed the idea of shock therapy in the sense of the need for wholesale privatization. Instead, it followed the logic of grasping the big and letting go of the small, which in some sense was a continuation of the logic that emerged in the 1980s, in that in the 80s, the battle was really over whether or not the state should let go of its direct control over the core of the industrial economy. In the late 1990s, the privatizations pursued in a fashion that continued the control of the state over the biggest, most powerful state-owned enterprises, those parts of the state-owned enterprise system that were considered as necessary for the future industrialization project, which does not mean that this did not come at enormous social costs, but it followed a logic that I think is distinct compared to the idea that private property, private ownership is always the better economic strategy. Now, you asked me about today's model in China, and you use the term alternative. My point is not to argue that China's economic model today presents some sort of a wholesale alternative to neoliberalism that we can aim to emulate and that challenges whatever kind of state market arrangement or variety of capitalism we are living through in Europe or the United States. But rather, I think that in order to understand the workings of China's economy today, it is fruitful to not only look at it through the lens of neoliberal economics or neoclassical economics, if you want so. And I think that we are observing a formation of state-market relations that is based on the logic that the state, through its various institutions, is an active participant in the market, not only the market for money, as the central bank is in pretty much any kind of capitalist economy, but in the market for a whole range of important goods. This involves things like, for example, metals, grain, and so on. So very basic commodities where we have in recent times seen that the Chinese state has mobilized its reserves to stabilize the prices of such key commodities. But it also involves, of course, land. It involves a whole range of important sectors, including real estate, which has, of course, resulted in enormous economic challenges in recent years and these days in particular. So as such, I think that we are observing a state that is designed to create, participate, and steer markets, not only on the macro level, but on the level of specific sectors, industries, and rearms of the economy, which means that the Chinese state it has an enormous capacity in guiding markets, while at the same time, the Chinese economy and society are deeply marketized as a result of the initiatives of the state.
Yes, it sounds to me like a good definition of state capitalism.
Well, we can call it state capitalism, we can call it whatever we want to, but I think that that it is useful to unpack the specific. We can also call it state-permeated capitalism. We can call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics and so on. I'm not invested in any specific label. I've started to think of it as a state-constituted kind of capitalism. But I think it is worth studying the specific modes of interaction between state and market in the Chinese context on its own terms and in the context of its own history of reform and a more long-term history of thinking markets and the role of the state.
I fully agree to you. We need more empirical studies, right, on the economic and social history of China, and then in the end we might come to a conclusion how to label it. We all wait patiently. We'll wait patiently for your follow-up book. Yeah. So the next part.
Me too.
And thanks a lot for your time and the interview. Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me, Felix.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.